This story follows Miss Marple as she uncovers an ancient secret of how the moon guides the growth of life on Earth, a calm mystery of nature, patience, and the forgotten language between light and living things. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. I am your host, Elias. Let's begin the story. Chapter 1. The Pottery at the Well. The well should have been ordinary moss on its stones, a bucket chain creaking like an old hymn, but the foreman's shout turned the churchyard into a stage. "Mind the shards," he cried, as the iron winch juddered and a leather sling rose from the dark. Villagers drifted nearer, pulled by curiosity's gentle rope. Up came silt, pebbles, a bent teaspoon, and then a curved shoulder of clay, slick with centuries, etched with thin, rippling lines that caught the October light. Miss Marple had not come for relics. She had come for quiet. She'd promised herself a week in the village, near the river, no committees, no improvised teas for policemen, only walks and early nights. Yet here she found herself by the lich gate, gloved hands folded, watching the well give back its secrets like a careful miser counting coins. The vicar, Reverend Armitage, coughed into a handkerchief that had witnessed too many parish meetings. "Old drainage," he said hopefully. "Old language," Miss Marple corrected gently. The lines on the clay curved and nested, not like decoration, but like breath marks. Spirals met at small notches. Tiny dots marched in pairs. It had the look of something written by patience. "Lydia," the foreman called. "Your table." Dr. Lydia Reinhardt arrived at a brisk, apologetic trot, carrying a folding tray and the look of someone who loved fragile things on principle. She sat down, felt pads, met Miss Marple's eye, and smiled without wasting a second on explanation. The sling deposited its burden with a wet sigh. 7 fragments, 2 large, 5 small, all etched with the same fine waves. Lydia's fingers hovered above them, attentive but refusing to touch. Pottery, she breathed, but not domestic. Signatures like title charts. Or calendar marks, if the calendar had learned to sing. Miss Marple leaned closer. The lines were shallow, yet confident. Whoever cut them had not trembled. They carried the fragments into the vestry because the air there behaved. The foreman's lads shut the well with planks. The village, having contributed the correct number of opinions, remembered errands and dispersed. Lydia laid the pieces on felt, arranging their edges without forcing a fit. "We'll not glue a past together just to keep our hands busy," she murmured. "We listen first." Miss Marple took to the listening with domestic skill. She noted grit in the incision's fine, pale flecks that were not local sand. The clay's underside had mica glints. The spiral marks were not thrown. They were cut after firing by a tool that knew what it wanted. "A practiced hand," she said. "Not art for a mantelpiece. Instructions?" Reverend Armitage returned with a ledger older than anyone had a right to. "Lift. Church repairs in 1798, he recited. Mentioned moon pots unearthed near the north wall. Returned to ground lest the lads make use of them on mischief nights." He looked up, half amused, half appalled. "Which is either folklore or policy." Lydia's eyes lit. "Moon pots," she repeated. "Celine will be insufferable." "Celine?" Miss Marple said mildly. "Dr. Park," Lydia said, "astronomer on loan to the Institute. She names files, after constellations, and boredom after committees." She glanced at the vestry window. Outside, cloud broke and mended again. "There's a demonstration in the heavens tonight. Partial lunar halo, clean air. If these lines are what I think they are, what do you think they are?" Miss Marple asked, though she already suspected. "Timing," Lydia said. "Not power, rhythm, a way to tell the earth when to be brave." Miss Marple smiled. "We might invite the moon to tea, then." Dusk arrived on cat feet and sat in the churchyard without a fuss. Lydia and Miss Marple lifted the fragments back to the well mouth, not for spectacle, but for light. The vicar, indulgent rather than convinced, allowed the vestry lamp to be switched off. The foreman came back with his cap in his hand, as men do when they sense that something old has elected to be young again. The moon rose through a thin veil, silver and self-possessed. It laid a polite ladder on the stones. At first the fragments did nothing. Then the faintest tremor of luminance migrated along a cut-one spiral, ringed itself in a soft sheen. Then the next, pulsing so quietly that one might have called it imagination if the pulse had not repeated in measured courtesy. Thomas Holly, Lydia's assistant, appeared breathless, having run the lane with delicacy in bad shoes. "I brought the filters." He unfolded a small black frame and held it above the fragments, screening off stray lamplight. The glow sharpened, not bright, never vulgar, just a subtle clarity, like breath on glass making a message legible. The dots in pairs winked once, then stilled. The tiny notches answered 2 beats later. Lydia's voice found a whisper that did not dare command. "See the phase cadence? 2, pause, 2, pause, no, look 3, then long." She reached for her notebook and stopped herself. No ink, not here. Miss Marple did not count out loud. She counted the quiet between. The intervals belonged to seasons, not clocks. "Not a map," she murmured. "An etiquette. How to arrive, how to depart." "Planting," Thomas said, dazzled. "Watering. Harvest by moonlight to keep starch asleep. Sow by thin crescent. Prune by patience," Miss Marple finished. The one method most often omitted from handbooks. The vicar, who refused to be entirely charmed by phenomena, made a reasonable objection. "Phosphorescence. Mineral residue. Our minds love patterns." "Our minds also love bread," Lydia said gently, "and people have sung to wheat since the first bowl." The glow sighed back into clay, as if tired of being understood. The moon lifted higher. The churchyard remembered it was a place for names. Inside the vicarage kitchen, they set cups on the scarred oak table. Tea steam rose with good intentions. The kettle clicked in approval. The night beyond the window was a proper English night, temperate, eavesdropping, shy about drama. Lydia had placed the largest fragment on the sill, half in lamplight and half in moon. It refused to glow now, which made Miss Marple like it more. "Cellini will say phase diagram," Lydia said with affection and exasperation. "She'll be right, mostly. But those paired dots, they're not only days, they're breath marks. Places to stop talking to the soil so it can think." Thomas wrapped his hands around his cup as if tea knew more than he did. "In the orchard on the east ridge," he said slowly, "the old trees fruit every other year, as if the off year were a secret appointment. The keeper told me he turns the irrigation at night by listening to birds, not by the gauge. He said water's a lady. Ask, don't pour." I laughed at him in my head. I shouldn't have. Reverend Armitage paged his ledger, frowning kindly. "There's a hymn recorded here I've never sung. Luna Dawsett, Germina the moon, teaches the seeds." The margin adds, "Not in power but in time. We can't date it. Ink is stubborn about dates." He closed the book and looked to Miss Marple with the wise cowardice of men who understand that the oldest laws are always social first. "If we announce this, we'll have visitors, and opinions, and men who want patents." "Then we won't announce," Miss Marple said. "We will observe. We will let the thing say what it came to say, without asking it to produce a certificate." She sipped her tea, content that it had not been sweetened into flattery. "Tomorrow we bother Dr. Park. Tonight we thank the moon for doing her. Work whether we clap or not." A draft moved through the kitchen cool. carrying the smell of wet stone and apples pretending to be lanterns. The fragment on the sill picked up a breath of sheen and let it go. Lydia watched it the way one watches an infant sleep-awed because nothing need happen for meaning to be present. Miss Marple set down her cup and stood, her chair obligingly quiet. "I will walk home," she said. "The lane and I have old business." She pulled on her coat, found her hat in the shape it preferred, and paused in the doorway. "Lydia, dear, lock the fragments in the vestry. Men steal mysteries to save themselves the inconvenience of faith." Lydia nodded. Thomas, chastened by a night that had remembered how to be gentle, reached for the tray. Miss Marple stepped into the yard. The moonlight put a soft polish on every unimportant thing-gate latch, puddle, a weed too sturdy for theology. She breathed, counted 3, paused, counted 3, an old village woman humoring a new old rhythm, and felt the world answer, not in spectacle, but in a small, correct easing of the heart. The lane took her weight without complaint. Somewhere beyond the hedge, an owl declined to explain itself. Behind her, the vicarage lamp dimmed. Ahead, the path made its quiet argument for going on, and above, the moon, sensible, faithful, unconfused by applause, kept its lesson without words. Chapter 2. The Imprint That Glistened. The vestry smelled of linen and old wood when Lydia came early the next morning, arms full of notebooks she had promised herself she would not use too quickly. Dawn filtered through the narrow stained glass window in soft amber ribbons. The pottery fragments lay where they had been locked, on the felt pads, quiet, undecorated, utterly unremarkable under the daylight. Miss Marple was already seated in the nearest wooden chair, as though she had grown there in the night. "Good morning, my dear," she said, as naturally as if she'd woken in that very room. "You're early," Lydia murmured, though she smiled. "I thought I'd have the luxury of staring at these in silence." "Silence is most helpful when shared," Miss Marple replied. She did not move closer to the fragments. She simply watched them, as though waiting to see what they wanted before deciding what she thought. The morning light shifted. The faintest shimmer, no more than the suggestion of memory, traced along one of the etched spirals. It was not glow. It was recognition, as though the clay remembered something the sun was too bright to hold. Lydia felt her breath catch, the way one does when something familiar suddenly looks unfamiliar. "There," she whispered. "It's responding." Even now, Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Some things do not wake at night," she said. "They wake at attention." A knock at the vestry door interrupted the hush. It was Thomas Howe, carrying 2 satchels, hair rumpled with the earnest exhaustion of someone who has chosen wonder instead of sleep. "Dr. Park is coming," he said. "She got my note. I may have used the word luminous too many times." "Oh, dear," Lydia sighed. "She assumed we've joined a cult." Miss Marple chuckled. "We have, the cult of care." Dr. Celine Park arrived precisely as predicted. Brisk steps, purposeful shoulders, lab coat still dusted with chalky fingerprints of blackboard calculations. Her eyes, sharp and alert, swept the room in one unbroken line. "No one has broken anything, I hope," she said, setting her star charts down with decisive affection. Then, without preliminaries, "Show me the impossible thing." Lydia lifted the filter frame and extinguished the lamp. Thomas moved aside. Miss Marple simply breathed. When Dr. Park held the fragment beneath the frosted pane of window light, the etchings shifted in tone, not glowing, not shining a lining. The curves caught the light at intervals so regular they might have been a heartbeat mapped into stone. Park's eyes narrowed. "These aren't decorative spiral motifs. They're phase arcs. The timing match is too precise to be accidental." "Phase arcs?" Thomas echoed. Lunar ascension intervals, Park said. You could track planting seasons by them. And with this ratio, she tapped the arc gently with a pencil. You could also predict tidal influence, soil hydration cycles, and lunar reflective growth encouragement. Lydia tilted her head. In English, Celine, Park exhaled. The moon doesn't just light the night sky. It influences water, not just in oceans, in sap, in soil, in seeds. She held up the shard. This is a lunar agricultural language. A calendar designed not to command nature, but to harmonize with it. Miss Marple nodded, as though she had been waiting for this sentence to arrive. The moon teaches the seeds when to wake, she murmured, repeating Reverend Armitage's hymn fragment. Park blinked. Yes, poetically phrased, but yes, exactly. Thomas looked between them. So someone knew this long before us. Oh, long before us, Park said. Long before weather stations, long before fertilizers, before clocks. She touched the fragment with something like reverence. Lydia saw it, too. Not awe of power, awe of gentleness. They decided to test the fragment under proper moonlight again. Not in the open churchyard this time, in the orchard, where the soil remembered songs. Reverend Armitage unlocked the old gate that evening, his lantern a modest, glowing pearl in the dark. The orchard greeted them like a room with secret rows of apple trees, bark silvered by dew, their leaves still, though no wind slept there. It has always borne fruit, he said quietly, even in years when other orchards sulked. He did not explain how he knew to call drought sulking. He simply did. Lydia placed a largest pottery fragment against a smooth stone at the center of the orchard floor. Thomas adjusted the lantern so it cast no direct light. Park lifted the filtered glass frame again. Miss Marple watched the trees instead of the shard. She knew better than to stare too closely at the thing everyone wanted to stare at. The moon climbed slowly. The orchard did not react at first. Then a very soft luminescence unfolded along the spiral. Not a glow, a breathing pattern. 3 pulses of light, a stillness, then 2, then a wait, then 3 again. Thomas whispered, "That's the same pattern the orchard keeper uses when watering. 3 counts pour, pause, 2 counts drip." Lydia's fingers trembled. He wasn't guessing. Park swallowed. Her disbelief had not been defeated, only transformed. "Whoever created this," she said slowly, "understood growth as listening, not forcing." Miss Marple exhaled, and the orchard seemed to exhale with her. "It is very hard," she said, "to remember that something ancient may still be right." They stood a long while in silence, not enchanted, but invited. "There is a difference." A twig snapped, not near them, at the orchard's edge. A dark figure, barely more than a silhouette, moved between the tree shadows, not in haste, not in fear, purposeful, familiar with the ground. Thomas whispered, "Someone else knows." Park stepped forward impulsively, but Miss Marple touched her sleeve with just one finger. "No," she said. "Let them go." A truth that is shared by one person in the night tells us more than any confession. The silhouette paused, head turned slightly, as though listening to them, then quietly slipped away, leaving only leaf lint and the faint shape of a path. Thomas shivered. Who was that? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She did not chase suspicions. She let them ripen. At last she spoke. "The orchard has been speaking for a very long time," she said, "and someone else has been listening longer than we have." They extinguished the lantern, gathered the fragments, and stepped back into the night. The moon followed them home. Default text. Chapter 3. The Astronomer's Theory. The next morning found Dr. Celine Park already in the orchard, coat dusted with dew, her hair pinned up with the kind of efficiency that suggested she had solved 5 equations before breakfast. She had brought instruments, not heavy industrial things, but delicate brass tools that folded like birds' wings. A sextant gleamed faintly in the early light, its polished arc catching pale morning gold. Thomas yawned beside her, notebook half open, pencil tucked behind his ear like a promise he might keep later. Miss Marple stood a short distance away, leaning lightly on her walking stick, not because she needed it, but because it gave her a pleasant excuse to pause wherever she wished. Lydia knelt near the pottery shard placed once again upon the orchard's central stone. The sunlight did not make the symbols glow, but in this softer daylight they looked almost tender. "It's not magic," Park said, adjusting a tiny lens. "It's geometry, lunar geometry, to be precise." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, the world has always mistaken gentleness for mystery." Park unfolded a vellum sheet she had prepared overnight. Upon it were circles within circles, arcs intersecting at repeating intervals, patterns that echoed the same spirals etched into the pottery. Lydia leaned closer, her breath stilling. "You traced the carving pattern," she whispered, "and overlaid the lunar phases." "Yes," Park replied, "and they match. Not perfectly, but deliberately." Thomas looked between them, brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Park said, tapping her pencil lightly, "someone hundreds, possibly thousands of years ago mapped the moon's visible cycle, not as a calendar, but as a conversation." "A conversation," Miss Marple repeated softly. Park nodded. "Yes, look here. Most calendars simply track the time the moon rises and sets. But this," she pointed to a spiral's inner curve, "tracks the angle of reflection, the moonlight's influence on moisture retention." Thomas's eyes widened. "You mean the orchard grows because it's being asked to," Park said. "Not forced," Lydia exhaled. "Just as seeds in desert climates wait for a precise moisture signal." Miss Marple watched them all, the way she watched people playing cards. Not the cards, but the hands that held them. "And people?" she asked gently. "Do we grow under such invitations?" Park hesitated. Lydia answered for her. "We used to." The orchard's quiet deepened. If sound could become soft enough to touch, this was how it would feel. Reverend Armitage arrived then, holding under one arm a tattered book tied with ribbon. He moved slowly, but not weakly, like someone who understood that sacred things are not hurried. "I have something you should see," he said, laying the book upon the stone where the pottery had rested the previous night. "This is our oldest ledger. Not a church record, a village one. Oral rites, harvest customs, seasonal notes, and music." Park blinked. "Music?" Armitage nodded. He opened the book to a page written in a hand that leaned forward as though walking toward its own meaning. The hymn was written in Latin, but not the Latin of church sermons. The phrases were shorter, more melodic, more affectionate. "Luna docet germina, the moon teaches the seeds." Below the lines there were marks, not letters, curves, spirals, paired dots. The same symbols as the pottery. Thomas whispered, "This is the same language." Miss Marple's voice was barely above the breeze. The people who sang this did not worship the moon. They remembered the moon. The orchard branches shifted overhead, though there was no wind. Park continued studying, tracing the rhythms while humming softly. Lydia realized the melody was slow, steady, like a lullaby sung to seedlings rather than children. Then Park paused. "There's a notation here beside the third verse." She leaned in, squinting. "Do not sing in haste, or growth will falter." Thomas sat up straighter, so even the song required patience. Armitage closed the book gently. "We are a people who rush," he said. "We have taught our crops to sprint. We have forgotten that bread used to rise with the sun, not with our impatience." Park nodded. "And when we rush seeds they resist, or collapse." Miss Marple looked toward the well beyond the orchard, the well that had returned the pottery in its own time. The well had chosen when to give back what had been buried. She knew the earth did nothing on accident. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the pottery was not lost. It was resting." They decided to test the theory not with force, but with courtesy. Thomas brought a clay bowl of water from the well. Lydia dipped her fingers in and let droplets fall in the orchard's bare soil. Park positioned the pottery fragments so the moonlight, though faint in daylight, could reflect at an angle she had carefully measured. They waited, not for spectacle, not for magic, but for response. Slowly a small seedling near the stone one no one had planted recently lifted its first 2 leaves. It was the smallest possible movement, but it was alive. The orchard did not bloom. It breathed. Lydia covered her mouth, tears gathering before she allowed them permission. Thomas bowed his head as if before a teacher. Park closed her eyes to steady herself. Miss Marple merely smiled. "Growth," she said, "is never dramatic. It is simply certain." The orchard shimmered not with light, but with belonging. There was only one person who seemed unaffected by the quiet revelation. Sir Rowland Keene stood at the orchard gate, hands clasped behind his back. His suit was pressed, his polished shoes out of place in the soil. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "Well," he said pleasantly, "it appears I arrived just in time." Park's jaw tightened. Lydia stood, shoulders protective. Thomas instinctively stepped between them. Miss Marple, however, simply regarded him with the mild interest of someone watching a fox decide whether or not to knock over the chickens. Sir Rowland removed his hat with deliberate politeness. "Ladies," he said, "I believe the ministry will wish to take custody of your remarkable discovery." The orchard fell silent. Even the leaves refused to rustle. Miss Marple spoke first and softly. "The moon has taught many things, Sir Rowland, but I fear it has never taught ownership." The air changed. The next chapter would not be quiet. Chapter 4. The Silent Manuscript. Reverend Armitage took a long, thoughtful breath before opening the heavy oak door to the church archives. The room beyond was cool and dry, kept so intentionally for paper that could crumble if offered too much of the present. Dust did not float here. It rested. The shelves were lined with volumes whose spines leaned like tired old men in conversation. The vicar lit only one lamp, a small one because large light seemed rude in a room where time had settled itself deliberately. Miss Marple followed without hurry. Lydia and Dr. Park came next, and Thomas hesitated at the threshold, as though afraid he might accidentally breathe too loudly and disturb the past. Sir Rowland had not been invited. Some doors can only be opened by quietness. Reverend Armitage set the ledger from the orchard gently upon a side table, then reached for another, a long, narrow codex bound in leather, blackened by centuries of fingers. No title on the spine, only an impressed crescent moon, faint now, like memory after grief. He carried it to the reading table and opened it slowly, as one opens something that once held grief, joy, or both. The script was careful, penned by someone who had known reverence. Miss Marple leaned closer, not to read, but to listen. Dr. Park adjusted her spectacles, tracing the ink with her eyes. "This is older than I expected," she whispered. "Not medieval, earlier." She pointed to the form of the letters. "These are half-uncial Latin forms, 5th or 6th century, maybe older. Someone preserved this intentionally." Lydia's voice was a hush. "But preserved where?" "The church wasn't built until centuries later." Reverend Armitage nodded. "This building is not the first worship that stood here. Beneath the altar stone are foundations of an older gathering house, and beneath that, his voice softened, something even older still. Faith has layers, Miss Marple, like soil. Miss Marple smiled. As do secrets. Thomas traced a finger just above the ink, careful not to touch. So this hymn didn't originate in the church at all. The church inherited it, or borrowed it, Armitage said, or tried to replace it but couldn't. The manuscript contained 3 sections. The first was text-measured and melodic. The second, hand-drawn diagrams of the moon's monthly phases. The third, those same spiral symbols etched into the pottery shard, arranged in lines like musical notation. Lydia's breath caught. They sang the growth patterns. Park closed her eyes, not in disbelief, but because something in her chest had just rearranged itself. It means the agricultural cycle was not mechanical. It was relational. The earth was a partner, not a resource. Miss Marple nodded once, as though greeting a truth she had seen before in smaller forms, gardens, conversations, grieving mothers. The manuscript did not instruct. It invited. Reverend Armitage turned a page to a short passage marked by a faded red stroke. He read aloud, voice low and even. Let not the watcher of the moon command her light. Let him receive it. For that which grows, grows only by consent. The seed wakes when spoken to gently, and sleeps when spoken to in haste. No one breathed for a moment. Thomas swallowed. This is the opposite of how agriculture works now. No, Miss Marple said softly. This is how agriculture worked, before we forgot we were part of the world and not above it. Park's jaw tightened, not with argument, but with sudden understanding. If Sir Rowland gets this manuscript, he'll industrialize it, turn harmony into technique, turn rhythm into yield charts. Lydia shut the manuscript gently. We cannot let that happen. Reverend Armitage clasped his hands. But neither can we hide truth forever. Knowledge is not a locked room. Miss Marple looked up, eyes gentle but clear. We do not need to hide it. We only need to remember it is not ours to control. The manuscript does not teach agriculture. Her voice was soft, almost like a lullaby. It teaches humility. A silence settled, not heavy, but holy. Miss Marple looked up, eyes gentle but clear. We do not need to hide it. We only need to remember it is not ours to control. The manuscript does not teach agriculture. Her voice was soft, almost like a lullaby. It teaches humility. A silence settled, not heavy, but holy. Dr. Park rolled the vellum chart and tucked it into her satchel. There is more, she said quietly. The symbols are also a map, not of land, but of timing. They show when to water, when to prune, when to leave fallow, and one more instruction. Thomas leaned in. What instruction? Park pointed to a lined notation beside a crescent moon symbol. That growth should be tended only under moonlight. Lydia looked up sharply. Not under sun? No, Park said. The sun gives growth its energy, but the moon gives it its measure. If we water or prune or seed in daylight, the plant reacts immediately, sometimes violently. But under moonlight, it listens, it breathes, it decides. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, the way one does when something resonates deeply. The orchard grows because someone kept the rhythm alive, she said. Someone who does not rush. Thomas stiffened, not with guilt but recognition. He had not confessed yet. But confession had already begun. A soft knock tapped at the heavy archive door. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Simply present. Lydia's brow furrowed. We locked the church. Reverend Armitage went to the door and opened it. Sir Rowland Keene stood there, not smiling, not polite, simply certain like a man who believes he has arrived at exactly the right moment to take what is useful. I'm afraid, Reverend, he said pleasantly, that I must request access to your manuscript. The ministry has been informed of its existence." Park stepped forward, protective. "You have no right." "Oh, I have every right," Sir Rowland replied, voice smooth as polished marble. "When knowledge can serve the nation, it must not be hoarded by hobbyists and sentimentalists." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes did. They became, for the first time since arrival, sharp. "Sir Rowland," she said gently, "you are mistaking power for purpose." He turned to her, amused. "And you are mistaking sentiment for progress." He turned to her, amused. "And you are mistaking sentiment for progress." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Progress without patience is only destruction that takes longer." The room stilled. Sir Rowland's smile faded, not in anger, but because he did not understand. And men who do not understand become dangerous. Chapter 5. The Orchard That Never Withered. The orchard looked ordinary by daylight rows of apple trees, trunks patched with lichen, windfalls sugared by wasps who had done their sums correctly. Yet something in the air felt accounted for, as if a ledger had been balanced in secret. Miss Marple let the path choose her speed. She paused where the grass was shortest and stooped to lift a flat chip half buried near a root flare. No bigger than a playing card, slate dark, its surface etched with a faint spiral and 2 paired dots. "Tiles," she murmured. Lydia knelt beside her. "Reflective shards," she said, brushing soil away. "Not glass slate with mica veins. Set just at the drip line. They'd catch moonlight and send it back to the feeder roots softly." Dr. Celine Park, shading her eyes, traced an arc from tile to tile. "They aren't random. They form a ring, then a second ring further out phyllotaxis in stone." She stood, pleased despite herself. Whoever arranged these knew both botany and patience. Thomas Howell, a pace behind, counted under his breath. 12 in the inner ring, 19 in the outer. Fibonacci. He looked up, cheeks bright. "It's a lunar irrigation map light, not water." Miss Marple turned the tile, noting the bevel. "Set to tilt," she said. "So the moon's angle is respected. No glare." Reverend Armitage arrived with a small basket, as if bringing civility to the conversation. "Scones," he announced. "I find moral clarity improves with butter." He saw the tile in Miss Marple's hand and nodded. Mr. Betts, the old keeper, used to mutter that the ground was tuned. I thought he meant drainage. Sir Rowland Keene stood at the gate, his slim figure framed by upright wood and policy. He did not enter. He watched the way men who like ownership watch, as if looking were a rehearsal for signatures. Park ignored him with professional precision. Lydia did not notice him at all. "Follow the ring," Miss Marple said, setting the tile back exactly where it had been. "Begin where the lichen thins." The ring led them like a soft-spoken guide. Each tile appeared just when they might have doubted the last. Half hidden under clover, peeking from moss, tucked against a fallen twig. At the base of one tree a tile was missing, replaced by a shallow, square-shaped shadow in the soil. Thomas crouched. "Pulled," he said. "Recently. See the crisp edges? No weather softening." Miss Marple's gaze slid to the trunk. A faint scrape marred the bark, a diagonal, wrist-high. Someone lifted it at night and nicked the tree in the dark. In haste. She glanced toward the hedgerow where, the previous night, a silhouette had paused. "Not Mr. Betts." Reverend Armitage drew a slow breath. "Our visitor," he said, not asking. Park scanned the outer ring and stilled. "There," she said, pointing. On a low branch, a strip of cloth fluttered pale, fibrous, caught on a spur. Lydia tweezed it free with the gentle annoyance of a curator rescuing a painting. From bad lighting, cotton, polished, slightly waxed, lab coat cuff. Park lifted an eyebrow. Mine are starched, not waxed. Thomas colored. Mine are not waxed either. Miss Marple turned the strip to the sun. It shone a little, the way things do when they've made a promise to repel rain. A coat meant to withstand damp, she said. Someone who expects dew. Someone who comes on purpose, not by accident. Sir Rowland stepped finally into the orchard, as if the gate had granted an invitation. If the ministry is to protect this site, he began, we must establish who has tampered with it. Protection, Miss Marple said, so kindly it sounded like agreement, begins with not hurrying your nouns. He blinked, uncertain which word she had just refused. They reached the orchard's heart, where the grass wore a path shaped by patience. Here the rings overlapped and deepened. Tiles lay in a braided pattern, their spirals oriented in alternating directions. Lydia's breath caught. Counter-rotation, she said, for nights when the moon's path lowers. It maintains evenness of exposure. Park knelt, measuring angles with her small brass protractor. 6 degrees, here, 8 there, imperceptible to the eye, but the sum. She looked up, unable to suppress a grin. The sum is a lullaby. Thomas, who had once dismissed farmers' sayings as folklore, pressed his palm to the soil. Cool, he said, even at midday. Reverend Armitage set his basket on a stump and poured tea from a thermos with the gravity of a sacrament. Sir Rowland declined a cup as if it cost him an argument. Park accepted and forgot her own hand while thinking. Lydia ate, half a scone without noticing, which is how you know a scientist is paying attention. Miss Marple walked the inner circle twice, then stopped by a stump whose growth rings had been sanded smooth. Someone had carved a neat notch at its rim. In the notch, a small metal pin glinted hammered flush. She touched it with her fingertip. A quarter mark, she said, for aligning a portable frame. Frame? Park repeated. Miss Marple nodded toward a shallow groove in the grass 4 feet by 3. Rectangle faint as a memory. Something often placed, often removed. A light frame, perhaps with gauze. Lydia's eyes widened. To diffuse moonlight. Thomas frowned. Why? The orchard already has tiles. To teach new rows, Miss Marple said. Practice before permanence. Sir Rowland's voice arrived, smooth and eager. A controllable apparatus, then. Replicable, scalable. Breakable, Park said crisply. As all good instruments are when the wrong hands insist on speed. Near the far wall they found a narrow trench, not deep, but recent, its edges sharp. At its end, a shallow well lined with stones no larger than fists. In its center sat a clay bowl, empty but for a ring of dried dew. Miss Marple lifted it, sniffed, smiled. Nothing clever, she said. Only clean water, but set where the moon can write on it. Park tipped the bowl. A faint etch ran around the rim-paired dots, short, notches. Even the water had instructions, she said softly. We have been treating nature like a machine that needs oiling. This orchard shows us a chorus that needs listening. Thomas glanced toward the lane where dusk began to gather in thoughtful folds. Who listened first? He asked. Who set the tiles? Who kept the tune when the church stopped singing the hymn? Reverend Armitage closed his eyes briefly. Old Mr. Betts tended this place as if it were a widow. Before him the record grows thin. He looked at Miss Marple. But the person who came last night, he is not of their patience. No, Miss Marple agreed. She lifted the bowl's base with 2 fingers to the light. A faint thumbprint marked the clay, ridged and familiar. He carries a new ritual. Hurry. And he wears a coat that thinks weather is an inconvenience. Sir Rowland cleared his throat. If this site is being interfered with, we must secure it at once. Park set the bowl back with care. You would put a fence round a moonbeam, she said, and call it policy. He flushed. Not from shame, he had not practiced that, but from the uncomfortable heat of being ridiculous in front of people who did not find you impressive. Miss Marple offered him tea then, because mercy is an old habit with her. He took it and was saved from saying something foolish. They stayed until the first honest star appeared. The tiles, hardly brighter than common sense, gathered a breath of sheen. The orchard's leaves made a sound like pages turned gently. Miss Marple stood at the heart, counted the quiet, and felt the ground answer in its patient grammar. A footfall scraped near the stile. Not Sir Rowland, he was 2 steps away, lost in calculations that would never be kind enough. Not Armitage the vicar, moved like a hymn. This step tried to be unimportant and failed. Thomas started. Park's hand went to her satchel. Lydia kept her eyes on the nearest tile, refusing drama the attention it wanted. Miss Marple did not turn. "Good evening," she said into the dark. "Pleasant as you please. You left a square shadow where your tile once was." Silence. Then a man's voice, roughened by honesty fighting employment. "I put it back," he said. "Later it needed cleaning." The frame warped and lashed. "Week's damp. I was trying to fix it." "Your cuff found a spur," Miss Marple said. She held out the waxed strip. A shape detached from the hedge and approached with the guilt of a schoolboy borrowing a ladder. He took the cloth, not defensive, now only tired. "I don't want to spoil anything," he said. "I was asked to make it brighter. I knew that was wrong. I tried to keep it gentle." "Who asked?" Park said. He hesitated. "A man with a car that waits. Not the gentleman with polished shoes." His glance flicked, unwilling, toward Sir Rowland. "Another? Likes to write orders on card with a ruler." Thomas exhaled. "A clerk." Miss Marple nodded. "And he told you to speed the moon." "I told him you can't," the man said simply. "You can hurry men, not apples." Reverend Armitage's mouth softened into a blessing. He did not speak aloud. Sir Rowland recovered his voice. "Names," he said. "If there is sabotage." "No sabotage," Miss Marple said. "Only the usual miseducation." She looked at the man. "You'll come tomorrow with us and show where the frame sits. We will set it straight or not at all." He nodded once, grateful for instruction that did not shame. Miss Marple watched him go until the hedge accepted him. Then she turned to the circle of faces she had been tutoring all day, without calling it that. "Now," she said, "we shall write down what we have learned before ambition begins to edit." Park opened her notebook. "Lesson 1, she said, and her voice for once was not brisk but tender. "Light is not command, it is invitation." Lydia smiled. "Lesson 2, patience is a method." Thomas, solemn, added, "Lesson 3, if you hurry the moon, you only make night shorter." Reverend Armitage closed the basket. The scones gone, the tea still warm. "And lesson 4, he said gently, what lives by rhythm dies by demand." Sir Rowland said nothing. He had finally chosen, sensibly, to listen. The orchard breathed. The tiles held their soft geometry. Above them the moon gathered herself for the night's true work, unhurried by men, encouraged by the quiet company of those who had at last remembered how to keep time. Chapter 6. The Visitor at Midnight. Night put its hand on the village and said, "Hush." A thin mist slipped along the hedges like a polite rumor that refused to hurry. Miss Marple waited by the vicarage gate in a coat that knew English weather, and a patience that knew English men. Lydia and Dr. Selene Park stood a little way off with Thomas Haw, their lanterns shaded, their breaths small clouds that went nowhere important. Reverend Armitage, who had a talent for being present without being visible, occupied the church porch with a book he never opened. They had not baited a trap. They had laid a welcome of the sort that allows a guilty man to choose truth without having to perform courage. Miss Marple had insisted, No police, no threats, no raised voices. If we frighten him, she'd said, he will speak in the language of corners. The orchard, meanwhile, spoke in curves. At last a figure appeared by the stile, the same outline they had seen before, moving with that peculiar mix of certainty and apology that belongs to people who do their work at the wrong hour for the right reason. He carried a narrow frame under his arm, draped in canvas. The frame's corners glinted in the moonlight aluminum. Not wood. Practical, portable, undeserving of drama. Miss Marple did not move. "Good evening," she said, as one might greet a neighbor returning a borrowed rake. The man paused, measuring possibilities. Then he nodded once and crossed into the orchard. Up close he looked younger than his outline 30, perhaps. Eyes honest, mouth tired. He wore a waxed cotton coat and boots that had learned this soil. "You said come," he murmured. "I've come." "Thank you," Miss Marple replied. "We will do this together, slowly." He lowered the frame near the inner ring of slate tiles and unbuckled the canvas. Underneath, a rectangle fitted with gauze so fine it was nearly an idea, its angle adjustable by thumb screws at the corners. Dr. Park drew in a small, involuntary breath of respect. "Diffusion without glare," she said. "Someone taught you well." "Nobody taught me," the man said, not proud. "I watched. The tiles tell you most of it if you don't talk over them. They set the frame where the grass bore that pale, rectangular memory Miss Marple had noticed earlier. The moon rode high but not proud. Its light pooled in the gauze, soft, and laid itself on the soil like a hand that knows where to rest. The man sighted along the edge, adjusted by half a degree, then stepped back, leaving the air to do what it had always meant to. Thomas whispered, "How did you know the angle?" He tapped the notch on the old stump that marked the quarter, and then a tiny scar on the bark 2 trunks over. "String line," he said. "You pull from there to here, then split the difference with the tiles. On damp nights you tilt a whisker more." Park crouched to look along the gauze. "No electric light? No mirrors?" "Only if the sky sulks," he said. "Even then, not too much. If you shout, it stops listening." Miss Marple liked him more each sentence. "And who asks you to set this?" she said, not as an accusation. "When the sky is willing." His jaw worked. The truth often barges first. The name arrives later. "A clerk," he said at last. "Keeps his hair flat, writes with a ruler. Says deliverables. He told me, speed it, make it show." He looked at his hands. "But you can't make a lullaby perform." Park nodded, the way one does when someone else has finally said the right thing in plainer words. "You were hired to stage a miracle," she said. "You tried to stage a kindness instead." He looked relieved, then worried. "Am I in trouble?" "Only if you start pretending," Miss Marple said. "What is your name?" "Evan Morse," he said. "My uncle runs the chandlery on the towpath." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Morse and Daughters. Your tins wonder?" He flushed. "I never brought pitch here," he said quickly. "Only the frame, and once a bowl. Clean water." Reverend Armitage closed his book without sound. "Mr. Morse," he said gently, "the orchard has been better for you than for the clerk." Evan took this with a gratitude that made him clumsy. "I only didn't want it to go wrong." Things go wrong fast when men in coats start frowning. They worked as a small, temporary choir, Miss Marple offering the rhythm, Park the measure, Lydia the tenderness, Thomas the hands. Evan set the frame for 3 positions, each time asking before adjusting, as if the ground might answer with a shrug. When he finished, he stepped out of the ring and stood in that humble bright of people who have done the job and are unsure what comes after. "Now we wait," Miss Marple said. They waited. The gauze soaked moonlight and poured it thinly, evenly, like milk over porridge. No leaf gleamed. No trick of spectacle announced itself. Yet something settled an agreeableness in the soil, a yes in the roots. A seedling that had been undecided chose up. A tired leaf forgot to droop. Lydia exhaled. "There," she whispered. "That's small choosing." Park smiled with half her mouth. "That is the only miracle worth scaling." A car door clicked faintly on the lane. Not a slammed door, the sound of someone who believes doors ought to apologize. Miss Marple did not turn her head. "We have company," she said. Sir Rowland Keene's silhouette inked itself against the hedge, a slender certainty topped by a hat that wanted to be a law. Beside him, another shape, thinner, with a clipboard glow in the hand. The clerk had brought his ruler to a moon lesson. "Mr. Morse," Sir Rowland called, voice low enough to sound civilized and high enough to carry. "I believe you're using our equipment without authorization." Heaven flinched. Miss Marple's hand, light as a leaf, brushed his sleeve. "Whose authorization matters most tonight?" she asked. He looked at the frame, at the tiles, at the tree. "The orchards," he said, surprising himself into courage. Sir Rowland entered by the gate as if it had been improved by his passage. The clerk came 2 paces behind, eyes already tiding the future into columns. "We have a schedule," the clerk announced, not waiting to be asked. "A full demonstration for the ministry at the next full moon. We'll require brighter output. This? Gauze won't do." Dr. Park rose very slowly, an astronomer acquiring her target. "You cannot timetable a plant," she said. "You can only embarrass it." "We can calibrate," the clerk said flatly. "You can offend," Park returned. Sir Rowland's smile arrived, late and uncensored. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us not be poetic. The nation requires food. If we have stumbled upon a method to accelerate growth, we will apply it." Miss Marple's kindness did not waver, but it did become firmer. "You have not stumbled upon a method," she said. "You have overheard a conversation and mistaken it for a command." The clerk stepped toward the frame. Evan moved without thinking 1 pace, then 2, placing himself between the gauze and the card with the ruler. "Don't touch it," he said, and there was no apology in it now. "It's set." Sir Rowland's voice cooled. "Mr. Morse, you will remove yourself." Reverend Armitage spoke at last. "Sir Rowland," he said softly, "the churchyard is not under the ministry's authority this evening, nor the orchard, nor the moon." Thomas found his courage in other people's. "You can watch," he told the clerk, "or you can leave. Those are the only operations available." The clerk hesitated, trapped between obedience to a hat and the irrefutable geometry of being unwelcome. Sir Rowland, seeing that numbers favored retreat, chose dignity's smallest version. "We will return," he said, "with papers." "Bring a picnic instead," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "Papers make poor shade." They left. Not far foxes seldom go far, but far enough for the orchard to forget them. The night stepped closer to itself. The gauze kept its work. Miss Marple closed her eyes for 3 breaths, then opened them to find the ground had answered her eloquence with its own. Calm. Evan sagged with relief. "I'll mend the frame corners tomorrow," he said quietly. "They flex in damp, and the angle wants constancy." "Bring no tins," Miss Marple said. "Only your slow hands." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Lydia touched the edge of the gauze. Park measured the faint fall and air temperature. Thomas wrote "Do not hurry" in a notebook that had previously preferred numbers to imperatives. Reverend Armitage, whose prayers were usually audible, said one the orchard could not have felt if it tried, because it was only gratitude taking off its hat. Miss Marple looked up. The moon went on with its decent work, unpersuaded by offices, unprovoked by fear. She thought, not for the first time, how many crimes are only schedules in fancy clothes. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will read the manuscript again and decide what to publish." We will name what cannot be owned and describe what must not be hurried. And we will tell the truth about the frame, that even good tools become cruel in impatient hands. Evan bundled the canvas back over the gauze and buckled the straps. He did not look behind him as he left. People who have chosen the right side rarely do. The mist lifted a little, as if the night had found fewer reasons to hide. They closed the gate and walked back toward the vicarage together, tired in the useful way. At the porch, Miss Marple paused. "Celine," she said softly, "when they come with papers, bring stars." Dr. Park understood. "Charts," she said. "Angles. Proofs polite men can read without panic." "And Lydia," Miss Marple added. "Bring manners." Lydia smiled. "Always." "Thomas," she said, "bring tea." He nodded, solemn as a clerk one of the good kind. "Yes, Miss Marple." Reverend Armitage turned the porch lamp low. The village, satisfied with its chapter, turned the page. Above it all, the moon taught the orchard another small word in the only language growth ever truly learns: enough. Chapter 7. The Confession of Thomas Holly. Morning put a silver edge on everything that could forgive. In the vicarage kitchen, steam rose from the kettle, as if practicing gentleness. Miss Marple sat with her hands around a cup that refused to cool, listening to a silence that had a name. Thomas Howell stood by the dresser, not moving, as if a single gesture would spill the truth before he knew how to catch it. "Come and sit, dear," Miss Marple said. "Confessions prefer chairs." He obeyed, folding himself down as if the chair were delicate. Lydia and Dr. Celine Park took the other side of the table. Reverend Armitage leaned in the doorway, like a bookmark placed to keep everyone from losing their page. Thomas cleared his throat. "I should have said it the first night," he began. "But I thought if I waited perhaps it would grow into something I wasn't ashamed of." "Shame," Miss Marple said, "is the gardener who waters after dark so no one sees the bucket. Get on." He gave a small, startled laugh. Then he opened the satchel at his feet and drew out a narrow notebook bound with twine. The cover was smudged with soil. A corner bore the faint arc of a crescent traced in graphite. "I started 5 months ago," he said, "in the east field behind the old brickworks. Dry ground, miserable tomatoes. I set a line of pebbles like the pottery spirals and watered only at night. Every third night in the first fortnight, then every fifth. I kept the tether." He glanced at Park, the angle by eye. The plants didn't leap. They settled. They stopped sulking. He pushed the notebook toward Lydia. "I made rubbings of the orchard tiles and copied them. I told myself it was study." Park's face softened. "You were listening. I also hurried," Thomas said quietly. "When Mr. Betts fell ill, I tried to help the orchard do more for market day. I angled the gauze 2 degrees too high and kept it there for a run of cloudy nights. I think I made a young roe restless." Lydia flipped pages, reading his hand, neat, earnest, a little too eager to be good. "You wrote everything," she murmured, "even the mistakes." "That's the part I didn't say," he whispered, because the clerk came after. Miss Marple set the kettle off the ring and let its small anger die. "Describe him," she said. "Had a size too small," Thomas answered. "Shoes that learned how to shine indoors. He said he worked for a man who worked for Sir Roland, not with for. He knew about the tiles. He knew about the frame. He said the ministry could sponsor my doctoral fellowship if I showed them how to make the orchard perform on a schedule." Reverend Armitage's eyebrows lifted the parish expression for blasphemy. "A bribe shaped like kindness." Thomas nodded. "I told him fruit isn't a circus." He smiled like I'd said a useful line for his report and asked to see my notes. "I didn't give them," he swallowed. 2 nights later 1 tile was missing. "Which you replaced," Miss Marple said. "Yes," he whispered. "Badly. In haste." He shut his eyes. I wanted the orchard to forgive me so I wouldn't have to ask you." Lydia slid the notebook back to him and covered it with her palm. "Thank you," she said. "You were wrong. You are brave." Park reached for the twine, then stopped and smiled at herself. "May I?" She wiggled a finger. "Untie?" Thomas nodded. "Please." She opened to a page marked by a pressed blade of grass. A small grid of dates, a column of phases, a margin note in his careful script. "If you hurry the moon, you only make nights shorter." Park's mouth twitched. "I've been trying to say this in equations." "You wrote it better." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Any harm done?" Thomas winced. The row nearest the hedge 5 saplings. "Their leaves have gone brittle at the edges." "Not burned, just scolded. Evan says they need boredom." "Then we'll give them boredom," Miss Marple replied. "And we'll move the frame away from that row until it forgets we were clever." They walked to the orchard together. Confessions, like seedlings, prefer immediate planting. The morning had washed the world until it squeaked. Evan Morse was already there, cap in hand, frame on the ground, waiting like a man hoping a good decision might become a habit. "I said nothing," he said quickly. "I thought we'd look before we touched." "Good," Miss Marple said. "We are finished with grand gestures." They went to the troubled row. The leaves told the tale Thomas had written. Edges dry, color a half-shade too dark, new shoots reluctant. Lydia knelt, pressing her palm to the soil with the tenderness of apology. "They're not dying," she said. "They're tired of being asked to prove themselves." Park crouched, holding the small brass protractor at her knee. "You kept the angle through a run of damp nights," she murmured. "Gentle plus gentle becomes push." She looked up at Thomas. "We'll write that as a rule." Miss Marple straightened, back making that agreeable sound backs make when they have been honest with their owners. "Evan," she said, "will you set the frame 2 rings out and 1 notch lower than is flattering?" Evan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He sighted the stump's mark, then deliberately underset the screws until the gauze accepted the humbler angle. "This is cowardly," he admitted. "This is modesty," Miss Marple corrected. "Let the leaves forget we're here." Thomas stood miserably attentive. Miss Marple touched his sleeve. "You will sit on that stump and do nothing for 20 minutes, she said. "Consider it penance." He managed a crooked smile and sat. Park measured air temperature, then chose not to write it down. Lydia tested a bud with a fingertip and chose not to speak to it. Reverend Armitage offered the silence he kept for altar rails. After a while, a single leaf uncurled a fraction, which is the most dramatic thing a leaf can do when properly attended. "See?" Lydia whispered. "They are not angry. They just wanted the room back." Sir Rowland arrived with fewer edges than yesterday's sleep had ironed him, but not made him kinder. The clerk ghosted at his shoulder, clipboard ready to explain reality to the parts of it that resisted. "Mr. Hall," Sir Rowland said pleasantly, as if beginning a foreword, "I understand you have been assisting our efforts." Thomas stood, guilty and newly stubborn. "I have been assisting the orchard." Sir Rowland's smile thinned. "You are young. Ambition is not a sin. It is when it is impatient," Miss Marple said, perfectly mild. The clerk cleared his throat. "We are due to stage a demonstration at the full moon. The ministry expects." "Expect less," Dr. Park said, almost cheerfully. "We will provide a paper. Methods, margins, the geometry of restraint. No bright shows. Your demonstration will be a graph." Sir Rowland's eyes cooled. "Graphs do not move ministers. Neither do corpses," Miss Marple said softly. "And I have buried enough of both." He looked at her properly, for the first time saw that the small, amiable woman had outlived more foolishness than his office could invent. "If you obstruct national progress," he said, "you will carry that weight." Miss Marple smiled. "I am an old woman. I carry many useful weights. Here's one for you. Publish the ethics with the method, or you will reap obedience instead of food." Lydia lifted her chin. "Our paper will include a section on moral boundary conditions. The orchard taught us, do not compel." Sir Rowland studied the 5 saplings, their sulking edges, their patient cores, and for a moment something like comprehension walked across his face and refused his invitation to stay. He turned to the clerk. "Reschedule the demonstration," he said. "Indefinitely." Then to Miss Marple, "I will read your paper." "You will fund the restoration of the tiles," Miss Marple replied. He surprised himself by not arguing. "Very well." He left with a measured tread that almost learned humility before the gait cured it. The clerk lingered half a second, as if waiting for reality to apologize. It didn't. He followed. They stayed until the sun stood high enough to stop being interesting. Evan packed the frame as if it were a cello. Lydia brushed soil from her palms. Park drew a neat rectangle around the word boredom in her notes and added therapeutic intervention. Reverend Armitage distributed sandwiches that tasted like decent decisions. Miss Marple turned to Thomas. "Now," she said, "we finish the confession." He looked puzzled. "I've told you everything." "You've told us what you did," she said gently, "not why." He swallowed. "When I was 12, he said, eyes on the tiles, we lost the backfield to drought. My father kept saying it was nobody's fault. My mother kept saying it was the year's fault, as if the year were a person who might apologize if pressed. I'd promised I would find a way to keep a field from going away." He shrugged awkwardly. "I thought this was it." Miss Marple put a hand over his knuckles. "It may be part of it," she said, "but fields do not stay because we hold them fast. They stay because we remember their timing. You will remember better now." He nodded, and something in his shoulders unclasped. "Good," she said briskly. "You will draft the methods section this afternoon, include every mistake and the cure. Rest. Lydia will add the ethics, Dr. Park the angles, the vicar the hymn." She looked toward the hedge where the lane began its usual opinions. "This evening we shall read under the moon, and let it cross out anything proud." Thomas smiled properly at last. "Yes, Miss Marple." They walked back with the easy weariness of people who had done the right thing in time. Overhead, the sky practiced being ordinary, which is the hardest and finest miracle. The orchard took their leaving without complaint, already busy at its slow, decent work teaching 5 young trees that forgiveness is a rhythm, not a speech, that light is a reminder, not a command, and that the only language the moon ever spoke to the earth was this: grow but kindly. Chapter 8. The Claim of Sir Rowland. The notice arrived on thick official paper that smelled faintly of rain and other people's decisions. Reverend Armitage found it tucked under the parish door at dawn, sealed with a wafer impressed by a crown that had mislaid its humility. He read it once, then again, then brewed tea, as if the water might argue the ink into manners. By 8, Miss Marple, Lydia, Dr. Celine Park, and Thomas were gathered in the vestry, the pottery fragments asleep on their felt, the moon's language folded like a secret at midday. "Temporary custodianship and protective seizure," Armitage read aloud, voice steady. "All artifacts and associated records to be transferred to ministry care pending evaluation and replication." He looked up. "Replication." "Of patience," Miss Marple said mildly. "A bold ambition." Park took the paper, scanning the clauses. "They want the manuscript, the fragments, our notes," and her mouth thinned, "any devices used to induce or enhance photic response. That is, our gauze frame, and Evan's string." Thomas bristled. "They can't take the orchard." "They can fence it," Lydia said, keeping her voice gentle so the truth would arrive without panic, or trample it while measuring their compassion. Miss Marple folded her hands. They can seize objects, not agreements. The orchard made one with the moon before the ministry learned what a stapler does. She rose. We will answer politely, and we will be busy. Busy? Thomas asked. Publishing, Miss Marple said. When men bring boxes, give them paper. Paper that tells the whole truth. Angles, ethics, and the fact that nothing works when you hurry it. Park's eyes lit with a fiercer light than stars lend. Graphs and caveats, she said. Margins fit for saints. Lydia nodded. And a statement from the orchard. Reverend Armitage smiled. We call that a hymn. Sir Rowland Keene arrived at noon with 2 motor cars that tried to look like apologies and succeeded in looking like motor cars. He wore a gray suit that had mistaken crispness for character and carried a document portfolio as if it were a gentler sword. Behind him came the clerk with his ruler and a pair of attendants who knew how to lift boxes and not how to leave them alone. We come in the nation's interest, Sir Rowland said at the church gate, which did not return his greeting. Kindly produce the artifacts and any schematics. Miss Marple stood just inside the lich gate, the whole of her seeming smaller than the paper, but larger than the purpose that carried it. Good afternoon, Sir Rowland, she said pleasantly. The artifacts will remain in consecrated custody until a competent inventory can be done without harm. In the meantime, we offer a preliminary report. She held out an envelope heavy, addressed, ribboned with the quiet threat of peer review. The report will do nicely, Park added, stepping forward with a scholar's calm. Containment, cadence, no-show protocols. It outlines the moral boundary conditions without which your demonstration becomes an injury. The clerk, already composing a list of items to number, frowned. We must see the devices. You may see the orchard, Lydia said. You may not touch it. Sir Rowland's patience made a paper noise. Madam, you cannot instruct a ministry officer in his duty. Then the moon shall, Miss Marple replied. It has more authority. He blinked. Not in anger yet. In reorientation, as if the compass inside him had remembered there were other poles. Reverend Armitage lifted a small key and unlocked nothing in particular. If you will read the report, he said quietly, and attend vespers, you will understand why the parish is reluctant to hand you a conversation you have not learned the grammar for. The clerk wrote the word vespers with the suspicious stroke men use for nouns that threaten to outlive them. They walked to the orchard in a procession no one had planned. Miss Marple a few steps ahead, Sir Rowland beside the path struggling not to lead, the clerk measuring a world that refused centimeters, Park and Lydia content to let the grass choose the pace, Thomas with his hands in his pockets to keep them from arguing, and Reverend Armitage carrying a small tin of oil in case the gate forgot kindness. Evan Morse waited by the inner ring of tiles, the frame bundled in canvas, at his feet like a well-behaved instrument. He tipped his cap to nobody in particular, and everybody who deserved it. Sir Rowland surveyed the scene with practiced possession. We will require brighter output for a demonstration, he began. The minister. No, Park said, with the calm of a woman who has learned that mercy advances faster than raised voices. This orchard is not theater. The demonstration is a graph in our report. You may trust the measurements or you may repeat them slowly. There is no third option that spares the trees. The clerk drew breath for a regulation. Miss Marple's glance lifted, soft as linen. Mr. Clerk, she said, do you keep a garden? He hesitated. A tomato vine? On a balcony. Then you know, she said, that love cannot be accelerated by decree, and tomatoes can detect disappointment. He closed his mouth more from reflex than agreement. Sir Rowland shifted tactics. If this can feed the nation, we cannot hide it under a bushel. Publish it, Lydia said. Write its manners in type larger than its method. Print the words do not compel. Bind them to the angles with staples that hurt your fingers. Then share it. And build no devices without permission from the orchard, Miss Marple added. It has an opinion which is older than the ministry and nearly as patient as my temper. Evan set the frame down. We can show you the cadence, he offered. 3 pulse, pause, then 2 with the gauze low so nothing is flattered. Sir Rowland hesitated long enough for sense to catch up. Very well, he said, if only to prove that your caution is excessive. Caution, Reverend Armitage murmured, is simply courage that remembers. They set the frame at the modest angle Miss Marple had blessed. Afternoon light was still honest. The moon lingered beyond day's polite boundary. Even so, a hush took hold the orchard, recognizing intention, the tiles composing themselves into quiet. Evan adjusted a thumb screw by the width of a pen nib. Park checked the stump notch and did not change it. Thomas placed the clay bowl at the small well and added a palm of water. They did nothing else. The orchard did the rest. Leaves loosened, not theatrically. A droop corrected itself. A bud that had been undecided chose the courteous direction. The frame kept its gentleness as if it had been told a bedtime story and believed it. The light on the gauze breathed 3, paused, breathed 2 only, because those watching had learned how to notice. Sir Rowland watched too. His face did not admit defeat. It rarely admitted anything unruly. But the corner of his mouth unclenched, and his shoulders took off their epaulets. This would never pass in a demonstration hall, he said quietly. No, Miss Marple agreed, but fields are not halls, nor are the people who plant them. The clerk made one more attempt at authority. And the devices? Park handed him a single sheet from the report. Here, designed for non-coercive diffusion frame. Note the subtitle. He read aloud despite himself. How to make nothing happen in time for something to grow. Evan smiled into his collar. Sir Rowland folded the report closed, the way a man closes a door he intends to use again. I will recommend publication, he said, with the ethical appendix intact. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. And you will recommend that the orchard keep its voice. He inclined his head, which in his dialect was a promise. They returned to the vestry for signatures arranged like tea things. Miss Marple wrote a covering note in her tidy hand, to be read before any apparatus is funded, to be memorized by any clerk who owns a ruler. Lydia attached photographs of the tiles and their shadows, refusing spectacle. Park added charts that made patience look like science, which it is. Thomas copied the section titled Errors and Their Remedies, beginning with haste. Reverend Armitage appended a translation of the hymn, ending with the line that refused to grow old, for that which grows, grows only by consent. Sir Rowland took a pen, considered his name, and placed it where it would do the least harm. Custodianship, Miss Marple said lightly, tapping the ministry notice, is a lovely word. Do keep it. We prefer stewardship. It wears better in weather. He gave her a look that could have become fondness given a decade and a wiser profession. You win this round, Miss Marple. I would rather we all won the field, she said. He and the clerk departed before the light admitted evening. The motor cars made the noise motor cars choose when they are unsure whether they are heroes. Silence folded back over the church, not as a blanket, but as a friend. Thomas leaned back in his chair, as though gravity had suddenly remembered fairness. Lydia set her pen down and let her fingers rest, which they had earned. Park closed her satchel with the satisfaction of a woman who had smuggled mercy into a document. Reverend Armitage turned the lamp lower. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, listening to the pottery fragments not blow. Then she smiled, the particular smile she saved for puzzles that had chosen peace over applause. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will check the young roe, and after that we will be bored on purpose." Boredom, Park mused, as a method. As a kindness, Miss Marple said. Outside, the sky rehearsed the full moon without hurrying to arrive. In the orchard, the tiles waited like well-tuned notes. The frame dreamed of staying humble. And somewhere between church and field, a small nation no one could seize, the nation of leaves, decided to trust the night. Chapter 9. The Night of the Full Moon. The night arrived without ceremony, which is how the best guests come. Clouds parted as if someone had laid 2 fingers upon them and asked for room. In the orchard the tiles waited like tuned notes. The gauze frame lay folded at Evan's feet. The small clay bowl in the shallow, well-held clean water, drawn at dusk by Reverend Armitage, who believed in beginning things with courtesy. Dr. Celine Park checked the stump's notch and her brass protractor, then closed the kit as if to say, "Enough mathematics for now." Lydia set the largest pottery fragment on a low stone in the inner ring, its spiral facing the path of the moon. Thomas, having learned the art of doing less, placed his hands in his pockets and practiced not improving anything. Miss Marple came last, which was not a habit but a kindness. The orchard liked to greet her privately, the way old houses creak hello to those they trust. She touched the gate as one greets a friend, and took her place by the path's bend. "No lamps," she murmured, "and not too many expectations." The full moon climbed over the hedge, round and gentle rather than grand. It wore no crown, only a halo of very polite cold. Evan lifted the frame and set it at the modest angle agreed upon, thumb screws dialing humility rather than show. Park sighted along the gauze, nodded once and stepped back. The light found the mesh and softened. It fell into the circle not as a command, but as an invitation. A small stirring answered leaves adjusting their attention, the soil loosening a sigh the day had not deserved to hear. They waited not for spectacle but for consent. The first pulse lived in the water. A faint sheen ran across the bowl like breath on glass. 1, 2, 3, then rested, then 2 again. The same cadence that had threaded the pottery and the orchard's old tile rings. Lydia leaned forward, not to capture it with a camera, but to remember it with her face. 3. Pause, 2, she whispered, even under full light. "Amplitude is higher," Park murmured, her voice a soft page. "But the ratio does not boast." She drew a small graph in the air with her finger, and then, for once, did not write it down. On the fragment, the spiral did not glow so much as arrange the moonlight into understanding. The etched arcs caught and released at measured intervals, as if the clay were showing the sky the proper tempo for breathing on plants. The paired dots winked their kindness, water here, quiet here, nothing louder than a lullaby. Thomas exhaled a little too loudly, and then smiled an apology to the trees. Reverend Armitage placed the village ledger on a stump and opened to the hymn. He did not sing. He only traced the lines with his finger at the same slow pace as the bowl's sheen. The orchard breathed with him. Miss Marple felt the ground under her soul's answer, yes, yes, then rest. A fox passed the far hedge, paused as if considering a pew, and kept its opinions. Evan moved the frame by a hair. A sapling that had been stubborn and its edges softened, its leaves unpinching by a fraction no theater could have sold tickets for. Park measured the angle with a glance that had learned mercy and scribbled nothing. "Hold," she whispered. Lydia placed a second shard beside the first, smaller and more weathered, its spiral interrupted by a chip. The pattern compensated slower at the break, longer at the rest, teaching the light how to be patient with damage. "Adaptive," she breathed. "It invites the moon to slow down its scars, Miss Marple watched faces rather than stones. Thomas had the expression of a boy who had been forgiven twice and wanted to deserve it. Evan looked like a craftsman hearing his tool hum true. Park wore a scientist's amazement at finding the universe kinder than her equations. Armitage's eyes shone with the kind of joy that refuses to outshout sorrow. Lydia seemed to be, climbed a thumb's width, and the orchard allowed itself the smallest victory. One blossom decided to prepare rather than postpone. They turned the page of the night together. Thomas brought the clay jug and at Park's nod tipped 3 counts of water into the bowl. The sheen answered with gratitude rather than applause. Evan adjusted the frame not higher but lower, resisting the itch for brighter things. Lydia touched the chipped shard with a fingertip, then withdrew the touch before it turned into need. Sir Roland did not come. His absence felt less like refusal and more like good sense learning to be quiet out of earshot. The clerk, somewhere in a lodging house, was likely arranging ruler and pencil on a desk with admirable precision and no companionship. "Read," Miss Marple said to the vicar. He did, not the Latin, but its plain English. Let not the watcher command her light. Let him receive it. The words walked into the orchard without making footprints. The tiles breathed back their faint answer mica, catching a dusting of light, then releasing it before vanity found a foothold. Park finally allowed herself a single note in her pocketbook. Do not exceed the plant's desire to be addressed. She underscored it once, then put the book away as if it had been fed. Miss Marple looked up. The moon had taken on that middle night clarity that makes even honest hedges seem like scripture. "Now," she said, "we do the hardest part of any experiment." "Which is?" Thomas asked. "Leaving it alone," she said. They did. No one spoke for a while long enough to become true. A breeze arrived from the river carrying a faint scent of damp chalk and faraway nettles. The bowl's surface quivered, then remembered the cadence. The shards returned to their courteous arithmetic. A moth tried the gauze, approved, and went about its errands. Evan leaned one knuckle on the stump and stayed exactly there. A man holding a door open for a guest who would come whether or not he was helpful. "Full moon produces the clearest rests," Park said at last. "The signal is not louder, it is steadier. No jitter from the day's heat. Summer will be fussier," Lydia said. "We should write that down before we forget the cool." She did not write it down. Miss Marple glanced at the young roe, the one they had scolded by mistake and then forgiven on purpose. Its leaves now sat with the dignity of small creatures no longer performing. "Tomorrow," she said, "they will look like themselves and no one will notice, which is how healing wins." Reverend Armitage read a final line under his breath and closed the ledger. "We shall keep vespers for the orchard on full moons," he said. "Open gate, no lanterns, benches moved to the hedgerow so men with loud breaths will not be tempted to instruct the night." Thomas chuckled softly. "That is a policy I can sign." "Don't," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Just practice it." The moon, having finished saying what it had rehearsed for 1,000 years, went on with the useful work of being round. When at last they folded the frame and lifted the bowl, the orchard did not complain at being left. That, too, was a lesson. Things that have been heard do not cling. Evan buckled the straps with the care of a cellist. Park covered the shards with a square of unbleached linen. Lydia returned the smaller fragment to its padded box as if putting a child to bed late with chocolate on its chin. They walked back along the path, accompanied by a silence that had names. Now, rest, consent, measure. Thomas carried nothing and felt the relief of it. Reverend Armitage left the gate unlatched, a small declaration that the parish trusted the night. At the stile, Miss Marple paused and looked back. The tiles twinkled, not like stars, but like good advice, remembered in time. She lowered her head a fraction, her version of a curtsy to an elder. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will write the chapter that says the moon is not a mechanism, but a mentor. We will say that growth is a conversation conducted in patience, that light must never shout, and that the only safe apparatus is one a child could forget to set, and the trees would forgive." Lydia took her arm. "We will say that," she agreed. "And we will mean it," Park added. They went down to the lane, where gravel and dew agreed to share the night. Above them the full moon accepted their backs as cheerfully as it had, welcomed their faces. The orchard behind them practiced being ordinary again, which is to say sacred, and the earth, which had always known more languages than men have tongues, kept speaking softly in the one Miss Marple liked best, the language of time that refuses to hurry. Chapter 10. The Language of Growth. Morning laid its palm flat on the orchard and checked its temperature like a considerate nurse. The young row looked, as Miss Marple had predicted, unremarkable in the most encouraging way. Leaves held themselves without performance. The soil wore last night's quiet like a shawl. Dr. Celine Park arrived with her brass tools, but kept the case closed, as if the instruments themselves might enjoy a day off. Lydia and Thomas trailed behind with notebooks they did not rush to open. Reverend Armitage brought a folded bench and the air of a man who intended to listen professionally. Miss Marple, standing where the tiles braided their soft geometry, tapped the ground with her walking stick, as one might tap a teacup to settle its strength. "It speaks very plainly," she said. "We must learn to hear plain things as if they were important." Park smiled. "Translate, then." Miss Marple looked up through the branches to the late morning moon, pale as a good idea at the edge of speech. "The moon does not command. It keeps a rhythm, 3 and 2, with rests. The orchard answers because it recognizes courtesy. Growth is not a lever, it is a sentence, with grammar." She nodded toward the tiles. "The punctuation is here." Thomas grinned despite himself. "Commas, not exclamation marks." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And never a semicolon unless you've earned it." They laughed softly, the kind of laughter that improves soil. They chose a trial not for spectacle, but for clarity. 2 shallow beds at the orchard edge, equally prepared and equally modest. Evan Morse had cleared them before sunrise, tamping the earth with the gentle insistence of someone coaxing a child to sleep. Lydia produced a small folded paper of Seed's heritage peas, saved by a neighboring widow with a tidy allotment and a poor opinion of fertilizers. "Twice 12, Park said, pouring them into her palm. 6 to each quarter bed." Thomas wrote headings in his notebook: Bed A, haste, and Bed B, courtesy. The names, once written, corrected his posture. They sowed. In Bed A they watered by measure of convenience, a brisk pour, then fussing, then a second pour, because anxiety likes to be thorough. In Bed B they waited for the moon's thin day glow to rise a finger width above the hedgerow. Evan set the frame at the lowest, humblest angle. Park counted 3 breaths aloud, then 2, letting the rests be generous. Lydia tipped water in on the 3rd pulse, drew back her hand, and did not look again for the polite interval. Thomas recorded did not look again, as if it were a scientific variable, which today it was. Reverend Armitage chose to measure silence. He sat on the bench and wrote in his pocket Bible, attending a sacrament. The orchard accepted the entry with no fuss. When they finished, Miss Marple brushed the crumbs of soil from her gloves. "And now we leave," she said. "Leave?" Thomas protested. "But the results?" "Will not happen while watched like sinners," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Let them remember they are peas, not a performance. They retreated to the vicarage, where the kitchen believed in outcomes that arrived on time: tea, scones, jam that had kept summer in a sensible jar. Park laid out a sheet of vellum and drew a diagram that would have looked severe had she not labeled the axes with words that sounded like lullabies: rest, consent, patience, measure. Lydia began drafting a section titled "The Language of Growth," and did not apologize for her nouns. Thomas drew too. Tables and their headings behaved themselves. Evan sat at the doorstep, mending the frame's corner with a bit of brass he had found in his uncle's drawer. Every so often he hummed 3 notes, paused, hummed 2, then smiled when the metal chose to lie flat. Reverend Armitage translated a verse from the manuscript that read, quite calmly, "Let the gardener be slower than his wont." Miss Marple brewed a second pot, and as she poured, said to no one in particular, "It is always the want that gallops. Desire is a fine horse when it has reins." She placed a cup by each elbow exactly when it was wanted, but not before, which is as helpful a sermon as anyone could hope for. "Write this," she told Lydia. "Ethical conditions as reagents. Do not bury it in an appendix where men with rulers cannot trip over it." Park nodded, eyes bright. "Make it figure 1. Thomas added a footnote with a sense of mischief that felt like honesty. Haste increases error bars. They returned to the orchard in late afternoon, not to admire, only to check the beds had forgiven them for naming them. Bed A looked wettish and sincere. Bed B looked as if nothing had happened at all, which is to say, it looked hopeful. Park knelt by bed. "I can sense flood then thirst," she said. "The surface is compacted where we poured twice. It will mold later." She brushed a fingertip across, and the soil soaked under it. Lydia examined bed B without touching it. "Even moisture," she murmured. "No glare, no scold," she smiled. "I think we will see shy seedlings exactly when the moon pretends not to care." Thomas shaded his eyes with his hand. "When is the pretending scheduled?" "Tomorrow before breakfast," Park said. "We'll come then and not be disappointed." Sir Rowland, appearing at the gate with improved manners and fewer words, rested his hand on the latch, as if asking permission. Miss Marple granted it with a nod. He approached, found the beds, and sensibly kept his shoes on the path. "What do you expect?" he asked. "Less," Miss Marple said. He processed this, not with offense, but with visible effort. "And if less feeds no one?" "Then we will give it time until it is enough," she replied. "And if you need a miracle by Tuesday, you will choose a different field." He smiled just barely. "I will read your section on ethical conditions as reagents." Twice he looked at the beds again, a man trying an unfamiliar language on his tongue. "And I will fund a patient trial." "That," Park said, "is nearly fluent." Evening sloped in. They stayed to see if restraint would continue to win. Children's laughter wandered along the lane and did not climb the stile. A dog considered the orchard and declined to improve it. The river made the sound rivers make when the day has been easier than the week did. The moon rose pale, unashamed of its predictability. Evan set the frame for no more than an hour to teach the edges of bed B the habit of listening. Park timed nothing. She felt for the cadence and nodded when the gauze had said enough. Lydia covered the pottery fragments with linen and placed her hand upon the cloth as one greets a sleeping child who is not related to you but whom you wish excellent dreams. Thomas tucked his notebook under his arm and surprised himself by not adding a line. "I think I should bake," he said abruptly. "Buns?" Armitage suggested without looking up. "Bread," Thomas answered. "Slow bread." Miss Marple smiled. "Our methods section is already working." Sir Rowland, after one last look that contained more curiosity than claim, bowed the orchard a fraction, and left by the gate as if it were a teacher he would prefer not to anger. Before dawn the next day they returned, because one must never deprive oneself of fresh proof that patience has teeth. The orchard wore a dew that had remembered its job. The tiles kept their modest glitter. At bed A, the surface had cracked in shallow little frowns. At bed B, the soil's skin was unbroken, soft as a held breath. Lydia knelt. "There," she whispered, happiness keeping its voice low. A green thread had folded itself upward from the dark one, then two. Everyone's surprise except Miss Marple's, a third that paused halfway as if considering how to join the day politely. Park exhaled a laugh she had been saving for a year. Amplitude of emergence, gentle. She looked at bed A and winced. And there? Forced rehearsal. Bed A had a seedling, too, the embarrassed, hurried kind, thin and pallid, as if it had been woken by a shout. Thomas's pencil did not need to write the difference. His face had already learned it. Miss Marple leaned on her stick and regarded the two small proofs. "There it is," she said. "The language, translated, ask, wait, allow." She turned to the vicar. "Do write that as the opening line." Reverend Armitage obliged, his script steady. Ask, wait, allow. Evan folded the canvas over the frame, hands reverent and relieved. "Will you publish it just like that?" he asked. "We will," Lydia said. "With all our failures, men who hurry can recognize themselves." Sir Rowland, who had returned without the sound of a motor, stood behind them, reading the seedlings as if the nation should adopt them. "This," he said slowly, "will be difficult to explain in a room full of budgets." "Then do not explain," Miss Marple said. "Invite. Bring them to a field." He nodded, which meant the next argument would not be unkind. They packed nothing in a rush. The beds kept their secrets, which were not secrets at all. The moon went about its daytime modesty. On the path back, Miss Marple paused and touched Lydia's sleeve. "We have enough for the chapter." "We do?" Lydia said. "And for the ending?" Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "Endings are only the place where one stops writing. The language will keep speaking after the book is closed." Park tucked the vellum diagram into her satchel. Thomas tucked the word allow under his tongue, as if it were a sweet. Evan promised to oil the frame until it forgot pride, and Reverend Armitage folded the bench. Behind them, the orchard rehearsed another ordinary day tiles, soil, seeds, sky, every element fluent, every sentence patient, every comma earned. And the moon, content to be the quiet teacher she had always been, went on, reminding the earth of what it had never truly forgotten, that growth is a conversation between kindness and time. Chapter 11. The Trap of Ambition. Rain threatened all morning, and then thought better of it. The orchard settled into its everyday grammar leaves that neither begged nor sulked, soil that minded its breath. Miss Marple and Reverend Armitage met Lydia and Dr. Celine Park in the vestry to finalize the paper. Thomas arranged pages on the long table like tiles in a careful pattern. Evan Morse oiled the gauze frame until it forgot there had ever been pride in its corners. Park tapped the title block with a pencil, the language of growth, rhythm, consent, and non-coercive light. Lydia slid in the ethical preface. Thomas added the table labeled errors and remedies with haste, gives rest, at the top in plain letters. Miss Marple contributed the first line as promised, ask, wait, allow, and beneath it a modest sentence. Devices are servants. The field is sovereign. Solid, Park said. Readable. Difficult to misuse if one bothers to read. Miss Marple's eyebrow made a small, unoptimistic climb. People often skip the verbs, she said. The vicar brought a thin telegram, pinched as if the paper might stain. From the ministry, he said. A demonstration has been rescheduled at a neighboring experimental holding. Not on parish property. Tonight. His voice softened. They've taken it out of our hands and into their lamps. Lydia stiffened. Artificial moonlight, she said, dread tightening her mouth. They'll force it bright and call it proof. Park shut the folder like a lid on a hot pan. Then we must go, she said. Not to stop them, there's no authority for that, but to witness and write what harm looks like. Miss Marple found her coat, and to bring tea, she added. Men who hurry often forget the kindnesses that might save them from going too far. The experimental holding crouched by the river like an unfinished thought, two low sheds, a rectangle of turned earth surrounded by fresh wire, and, at the center, a steel mast with a crown of lamps shrouded in translucent fabric. The fabric pretended to be moonlight, the lamps intended otherwise. Sir Rowland Keene stood with his hat off and his confidence on, flanked by the thin clerk and a pair of men in coveralls who had learned obedience faster than botany. Miss Marple and her small company paused by the gate. The wire hummed faintly with borrowed authority. You were invited? Sir Rowland called, polite and firm. We are the appendix, Miss Marple said mildly. Ethical conditions belong wherever devices are built. The clerk consulted a sheet as if reality required his permission. We will proceed, he announced. Full illumination in 5-minute intervals. We expect accelerated photic response and improved emergence by dawn. Park stepped to the edge of the wire, not touching it. You will get shock, stress, and brittle tips, she said. The moon is a metronome, not a spotlight. Sir Rowland gestured to his men. The lamps came up, white, keen, unkind. The fabric glowed like a lie told to children. The soil shone in the wrong way, surface bright, depth ignored. Miss Marple felt the back of her neck object. 3 and 2, she murmured to Evan. Count it in your head anyway. We may yet save a row by refusing to clap. The clerk began a stopwatch. Mark, illumination phase 1. Within the ring, seedlings lifted too quickly, as if dragged by the collar. Leaves unfolded with a small, audible misery. The sheen on the damp soil flashed. The reflections jittered, nervous as sparrows under a hawk. Park's jaw tightened. Signal amplitude harsh, she said softly. No rests. You are shouting and light. Sir Rowland watched without blinking. The response is measurable, he said. So is a scream, Miss Marple replied. It is not a conversation. They raised the lamps again. The fabric radiated more fiercely. The steel mast trembled, wanting to be a lighthouse and succeeding at being a scold. The seedlings tried for bravery and achieved panic. A few stems leaned toward nothing in particular. One collapsed with the theatricality of the bullied. Lydia made a small sound, almost a prayer swallowed before it could embarrass the air. Observe, the clerk said, scribbling. Rapid extension, immediate curvature. We can calibrate. Or you can apologize, Park said. A third interval. Heat gathered beneath the faux moon. Humidity climbed without mercy. The soil's skin blazed. Thomas looked away. It's like waking a child every 5 minutes and praising them for being awake, he said. Then wondering why they cry. Miss Marple walked the fence line, noting the simple sins. Wires too tight, lamps too high, angles optimized for performance rather than calm. At the far corner, a shadow moved and resolved into Evan, who had arrived separately, and now stood with his cap in both hands, as if appealing to the night. He whispered, Miss, there's a low gate there. If you want to— No, she said gently. We will not trespass, they have chosen. We will choose to remember. A shout from the mast. One of the coverall men had unlatched the fabric to increase throughput. The lamps bared themselves, raw white, the sort of light that ooglies truth. A stiff wind came off the river and shoved the heat flat across the seedlings. The patch shuddered. Lydia spoke without lifting her voice. "Turn them down." Sir Rowland hesitated, the rare pause of a man discovering a boundary later than is comfortable. "Lower to half," he ordered. Too late for 3 seedlings, late for 4, early for none. They cut the lamps. The sudden dark felt like kindness returning from the shop with extra change. The seedlings sagged in the way of small things that have been asked to be large before they were ready. The soil, shock cold under the skin's heat, exhaled an unhappy mist. For a long minute even the river refused to remark. Park knelt at the wire and examined without touching. "Edge necrosis likely," she said. Stomata forced open, then slammed. "If you water now, you'll drown. What you frightened?" Sir Rowland took off his glasses and cleaned them. The ceremony men perform when stubbornness cannot bear a direct sentence. The clerk checked his stopwatch as if time might absolve a method. Reverend Armitage stepped forward. He was not a scientist. He did not pretend. He only recited, quietly, the single line the manuscript had given them for just this harm. Let not the watcher command her light. Let him receive it. The words lay on the ground and did not demand a miracle. They simply refused to be untrue. Miss Marple took the envelope from her reticule, the language of growth, and placed it on Sir Rowland's portfolio, light as bread. "Run the trial," she said, "but run the apology with it. Publish the failure as carefully as you would have published your triumph. In rooms where budgets sit, put photographs of these seedlings." "Right," we shouted. His mouth opened, then closed on pride. He nodded, once. "Very well," the clerk protested with remarkable precision. "We cannot." "You will," Sir Rowland said, not unkindly. "And you will include the appendix in full." The thin man's ruler slackened. A low rattling came from the massed metal settling, bolts reconsidering. Evan squinted upward. "Winds turned," he said. "That's the river telling the heat to go home." He looked to Miss Marple. "If we tilt the fabric and give the ground a rest, some might forgive." Sir Rowland hesitated. He did not like asking, and so he did the next decent thing. "Mr. Morse," he said, "show us how to do nothing correctly." Evan set his cap on a fence post and climbed the ladder with the steadiness of a man who had mended more roof than reputations. He slackened the fabric, lowered the angle until the lamps wore humility again, and tied the cords so a new gust would only make them kinder. Back on the ground he checked a seedling's shadow, nodded once, and stepped away. They waited in clean darkness. The river softened. A leaf somewhere remembered how to be a leaf. Lydia stood very still, as if motion itself might be interpreted as command. Park folded her arms, not defensive, simply choosing to keep her hands from fixing what they could only harm. "Write this too," Miss Marple said, voice almost a thread. "Remedy. Remove spectacle. Reinstate rest." Thomas wrote it without looking. At last a tremor ran through the patch that was not panic. 2 seedlings lifted by a hair, not to perform, but to resume. It was not a victory. It was a refusal to remain defeated. Which is better? Sir Rowland blew out a breath he had not told his lungs they were holding. "We will cancel the demonstration," he said. "We will circulate your paper instead, and we will fund a patient trial under the moon's supervision." Reverend Armitage bowed his head. "Good. The parish will lend benches. Men behave better when seated." The clerk cleared his throat, smaller now, less metallic. "Shall I draft a notice?" "Begin with 'We were in a hurry,'" Miss Marple suggested. "Then add, 'We will learn to wait.'" They walked back along the river path, lamps unlit, the night merciful. Evan wheeled an empty dolly, relieved to be carrying nothing. Park tucked the protractor away and felt no poverty in it. Lydia slipped her arm through Miss Marple's. Thomas carried the pen as if it were a lighter tool than it had been an hour ago. Sir Rowland came last, portfolio under his arm, pace slower than procedure requires. At the stile, Miss Marple paused and looked toward the orchard's dark roofline beyond the hedge. No light came from it. No glow offered comfort. Yet she felt that other certainty again, the one that never writes to newspapers. The world prefers to heal when asked properly. "In the morning," she said, "we will check the young roe and bake Thomas's slow bread. Then we will add one final sentence to the paper." "What sentence?" Park asked. Miss Marple smiled. "The moon is not a technology. It is a teacher." They went on through the field where grass kept its confidences and sky kept its distance, each of them thinking, in their own dialect, the same soft vow, to be slower than their wont, to let the rests carry the tune, and to leave the future in the only hands that have ever held it kindly times. Chapter 12. Moonlight Restored. Morning wore the color of forgiveness. The river moved without commentary. Swift stitched the sky with tidy thread no bureau could catalogue. Miss Marple stood at the orchard gate with Lydia, Dr. Celine Park, Reverend Armitage, Thomas, and Evan. Behind them, the vicarage bell gave one small, sensible note, as if to say, "Begin gently." They went straight to the 2 trial beds. Bed a yesterday's haste presented, its pale, thin shoots with gallant embarrassment. Bed B courtesy offered shy green hooks rising at their own measured delight. Park crouched, brushing nothing, and smiled with half her mouth. "Amplitude low, coherence high," she murmured. Translation: calm. Thomas knelt, elbows off the soil as if it were a sleeping child. "They look like they came up because the idea pleased them," he said. "Which, in a decent world," Miss Marple replied, "is the only reason to get out of bed." They checked the young roe that had once sulked under praise. The brittle edges had softened. One sapling dared a new leaf, small and lopsided, perfect in its refusal to apologize. Lydia placed her palm near not on the leaf. "Rest works," she whispered. "It always has," Miss Marple said. "We are late to the discovery." Sir Rowland arrived with quieter shoes and fewer conclusions. He carried no portfolio. The clerk carried a thermos and cups, which is how you know a document has learned something. "We've cancelled the spectacle," Sir Rowland said. "The minister will read your paper. He may understand little, but he will grasp the first line." Armitage nodded. "Ask, wait, allow. It's difficult to mispronounce." Evan set the frame on the ground and did not unfold it. The tiles kept their thin shimmer in the sun. Over the hedge the moon showed faint as a notion that prefers evening. They held a small, unlikely meeting beneath the oldest tree. Not to vote truth needs no quorum, but to decide how to let it live in public. Park spread the vellum on a crate and weighed the corners with apples that had not asked to be metaphors. Lydia placed the pottery fragments in a neat row as if they were witnesses called to speak. Thomas held the satchel of notes as one holds a cat who has decided to cooperate. "The manuscript," Armitage said, laying the old ledger beside the vellum, "will be digitized and kept in the parish, where time moves properly. We will sing the hymn on full moons, quietly, and not as a performance." "Good," Miss Marple said. "Let the village remember without remembering that it remembers." Sir Rowland looked from shards to tiles to gentle faces and found nothing to own. "And the fragments?" he asked. Lydia glanced at Miss Marple. "They were found by the well," she said softly. "They should return to the circle of their intention." "We'll bury them again?" Thomas asked, startled. "We'll replant them," Miss Marple said. "Artifacts are not secrets. They are seeds of memory. Some grow best underground." Evan nodded as if the decision had always been waiting there in the grass. "I'll bring the small spade," he said. "The one that doesn't pretend to be a shovel." Park added a sentence to the paper. "Return of context preserves meaning." Then, Because she had grown fond of clear nouns, she added, "No fences, only manners." The clerk, so thin he kept folding himself into usefulness, ventured a question. "And the device?" "The frame?" Miss Marple said. "We'll keep it for evenings when the sky sulks. We'll write on it, do nothing gently." Sir Rowland laughed, a discreet and human sound. "I shall order plaques for all our laboratories." "Order benches," Armitage said. "Men behave better when seated." They dug at the well in a modest circle just inside the grass, where the ground's color turned thoughtful. Armitage said a line not from Scripture, but close enough. "May truth lie where it can do the most good and the least harm." Lydia lowered the largest shard. Park placed the chipped one with its broken spiral kissing the earth. Thomas poured a cup of clean water, 3 counts, then 2. Evan sifted soil back in by hand, the way one tucks a blanket, for someone who will sleep better for not seeing you do it. Miss Marple stood with her palms open, not blessing, not ceremony, just 2 small invitations. "Rest," she told the ground. "We remember." A blackbird hopped onto the well's rim and made the sound blackbirds make when they have accepted your qualifications. Overhead, clouds took turns, and the world decided to be particular in its kindness. Sir Rowland removed his hat without being told. The clerk, uncertain whether reverence required paperwork, put his pencil behind his ear and looked relieved. Lydia sealed their academic packet with simple string. Park wrote in tidy block letters across the top, "The Language of Growth." Thomas added the subtitle aloud as he tied the knot, "Rhythm, Consent, and Non-Coercive Light." He grinned, suddenly young in the nicest way. "We made a good thing," he said. "You documented a good thing," Miss Marple corrected. It was already here. Afternoon unfolded like a page that had decided to forgive its reader. They walked the orchard in slow pairs, Park and the clerk discussing angles in a tone that might heal bureaucracies. Lydia and Sir Rowland trading terms for grants that would come with patience rather than applause. Thomas and Evan inventing small, repairable devices and how to keep them modest. Miss Marple took the outside path, where hedges act as punctuation. She paused at the stump with the quarter mark and touched the notch. "You have been a faithful thumb," she told it. "May you never meet a proud ruler." The stump did not answer. It had nothing to add. At the inner ring, the young leaf yesterday's beginner had straightened to its own idea of erect. It seemed to listen to the tiles the way one listens to distant music, not intended for you, but offered anyway. Miss Marple felt an old feeling then, not victory, completion. The feeling good menders get when the tear is no longer your business. They left the orchard gate unlatched. Some locks are insults. In the vestry they signed the final copy, Park in firm lines, Lydia with the patient flourish of a scientist who knows when not to apologize, Thomas with careful letters that did not hurry. Reverend Armitage stamped it with a parish seal, because villages enjoy small formalities like breadcrumbs. Sir Rowland added his name by the appendix and, almost shyly, endorsed the caution. "Tea?" Armitage said. "Bread," Thomas countered, producing a loaf that smelled like someone had told Flour a true story. They ate it warm with butter that accepted success modestly. The clerk, astonished to find himself happy, thanked Thomas twice. Evening brought its pearl of moon to the window. Miss Marple walked alone to the lane as she liked to do when endings unclasped. She turned toward the cottage she was borrowing, each hedge divulging its one fine spiderweb, each puddle lifting a small copy of the sky. In the window-sill box there, the pea of another story, her own, had lifted 2 leaves since yesterday, the tiniest green coat on the tiniest coat hook. She pressed a fingertip to the soil beside it and withdrew no fuss, no speech. "You belong," she told it. The sprout agreed by doing nothing dramatic. Inside, she wrote 2 sentences on a postcard for a friend who enjoyed the succinct. The moon is not a technology. It is a teacher. We are learning our letters again. Then she smiled at her phrasing, because humility and pride sometimes share a bench and do each other good. There came a knock with no hurry in it. Lydia stood at the door with Park, both women carrying faces that had finally slept. They sat. Miss Marple poured. They did not talk about publication, because some victories are too decent to be discussed at once. "Will it travel?" Lydia asked at last, meaning the idea. "It already has," Miss Marple said. "It traveled from an older patience to our impatience and survived the crossing. That's the whole trick." Park looked out the window at the modest moon. "What will the ministry do?" "Write a policy so timid it might be useful," Miss Marple said. "Then lose it, and find it again. Meanwhile, the fields will keep the time." They laughed softly, clinked cups without clatter, and let the quiet stand up straight between them. On the final morning, though mornings do not know they are final, Miss Marple returned once more to the orchard with Reverend Armitage to say goodbye in the language she trusted. Presence. A breeze moved through like someone tidying pews. The tiles had gathered dew in perfect dots, pairs and pairs, then let them go. The young row looked like a sentence that had found its commas. Bed B had made 6 honest sprouts, each precisely itself. Armitage closed his eyes. "We will keep vespers," he promised. "You will keep boredom," Miss Marple corrected, smiling. "It is the better prayer." At the gate, Sir Rowland waited with a car that no longer announced itself. He tipped his hat to the orchard as if hat and orchard had a private treaty. "I'll send the benches," he said, "and a grant for patience, if I can persuade the word to appear on a form." "Right maintenance," Miss Marple advised. "Budgets understand that kindness." He offered her the faintest bow. "Miss Marple, thank you for preventing me from being clever in public." "It was a group effort," she said. "Do try to be clever in private." He laughed and went away in the decent manner of men almost improved. Miss Marple took one last breath at the orchard's grammar. It said, "Enough for now." She answered, "Agreed." Then she turned toward the lane, where geese negotiated the right-of-way with bureaucratic courtesy, and the village pretended it had always known how to be kind to its fields. At her window box the sprout leaned a fraction toward the daytime moon. Miss Marple set the teacup down, folded her hands, and practiced the oldest lesson again. Ask, wait, allow. The leaf did not bow. It belonged. That was the bow. And the moon, faithful and unambitious, kept its appointment with the evening, writing the same patient sentence across the world it had written last night and will write tomorrow. Grow, but kindly. I am glad to learn that you are still here. Please like the video and subscribe the channel to get more videos like this.